Everyone. Welcome to our latest series of the Opta Live webinars. We're thrilled to be doing this again and to be starting off with 3Degrees as our first of our fall webinar series. We're expecting a good group with us today. I'll just mention that we are recording this webinar and it will be posted for on-demand availability on the Opta website. You'll be able to share it with your peers, and we are so glad that this is going to be able to be available to Opta members. At this time, I'd like to introduce John Summers. He's the transit lead for North America. Was pleased to meet John at our OTE conference earlier this year and to learn about the services that they offer. They're one of our newer Opta members. So thank you, John. Over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces on the screen today. Glad to be among friends. For those of you who don't know me, I've been serving the public transit industry in Canada and the US in various capacities over the last 16 plus years. And I've been an active member of Opta and other peer associations over the years, and I currently participate on Opta's ZEV committee. Here at 3Degrees, I help fleets access and aggregate credits in order to maximize revenue under the various clean fuels programs, including the new CFR program, which we'll be discussing today, as well as the long-standing programs in British Columbia, California, and Oregon. My contact information will be listed on the last slide. Please reach out to me with any questions or any interest in learning more about how the CFR can benefit your organization. I will also be at the QTRIC conference next week in Burlington, Ontario, and in Edmonton next month for both CUTA's annual conference and the Electric Mobility Canada conference. So please let me know if you'd like to schedule an in-person meeting. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dave Meyer. Dave is the Director of Transportation Markets here at 3Degrees. Dave has a wealth of knowledge and experience in helping fleets maximize revenue under the various clean fuels programs. And after a brief overview of 3Degrees, Dave will walk us through the CFR program and how it can benefit your organization. The presentation itself should last 20 to 25 minutes, and due to the nature of the topic, we're going to allow plenty of time for questions after the presentation. So without any further ado, I'll turn the meeting over to Dave. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks for taking the time to join us today to discuss a little bit more about Canada's new clean fuel regulations. I did want to start, as John mentioned, with a little bit of an introduction to 3Degrees, who we are, what we do, just to give you a little bit of a better understanding of where we're coming from. So to start, 3Degrees' mission is to make it possible for businesses and their customers to take urgent action on climate change. And everything that we do is really oriented around that driving mission. As a result, we are very much a purpose-driven company. We've been around for a little over 15 years now and have been a certified B Corp for the vast majority of that time, having received a number of Best in the World awards from B Corp for our performance. We see our role really as being a leading player in the environmental attributes and environmental commodities space. And the work that we're going to talk about today, as it relates to the CFR, is really a part of that overall role. In terms of the types of companies that we work with, I'm not going to go through this list, but this is just kind of a representative sample. Obviously, we work with some of the largest companies in North America and globally, and are also working with some smaller entities, particularly in the transportation space, again, related to what we'll be talking about here today. If we look at 3Degrees service offerings kind of as a whole, it's really around everything, every part of a company's greenhouse gas emissions footprint, scopes 1, 2, and 3. Some of that, again, may take the form of particular environmental commodities that we have. Others might take the form of strategy consulting around understanding what the emissions footprints are and coming up with ways to try to reduce those. So I would say, while the focus of our conversation today is on the Canadian clean fuel regulations, if you have questions or interest in understanding other aspects of your greenhouse gas emissions footprint, or getting help with coming up with strategies for getting to net zero, things like that, that's certainly something that we as a company would be interested in discussing with you. From a transportation perspective, 3Degrees operates as what's known as an aggregator across different clean fuel standard programs. So the work that we do is really helping folks access the incentives represented by those programs, things like the CFR, the LCFS in British Columbia, in California, and other clean fuel standard programs in Oregon and Washington. To that end, we are a large player in the space with a significant number of credits generated to date, and a number of pieces of what are known as fueling supply equipment, primarily chargers, hydrogen fueling stations, things of that nature. And we've been in this business for a long time. We were one of the first companies to generate credits under California's AB 32 climate programs back in 2013. So know this space very well, and have been active for a long time. So moving away from kind of 3Degrees and who we are, and getting more into the CFR, just to kind of level set, I'm assuming that many of you have some familiarity with the program already, but just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The clean fuel regulations are one part of Canada's effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Like other clean fuel standard programs across North America, it really focuses on reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. The program itself came into effect from a compliance perspective in July of this year, and applies to gasoline and diesel fuel used throughout Canada. The way that the program goes about reducing emissions is by establishing a carbon intensity target that declines year over year. So the current target at the moment is to reduce the average carbon intensity of the transportation fuel pool by 15% by 2030. Which, if I remember correctly, the Canadian government believes will result in roughly 26 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions reduced. The way the program works in terms of creating value for low carbon fuel participants is through a system of deficits and credits. So the baseline that exists for each year establishes the target for the emissions intensity of each fuel pool, and folks who produce fuels that are above that target in any given year generate deficits, while those who use fuels that are below that target in any given year produce credits. Each year, the folks who generate deficits are required to offset those deficits with credits, and that creates a marketplace where those credits can be transferred. So that's the kind of basic framework that all of these programs, including the CFR, use. And I should note that from a low carbon fuel perspective, that includes things that might be considered kind of conventional low carbon fuels, like liquid fuels, like ethanol or renewable diesel, biodiesel, things like that. But it also includes fuels like electricity, hydrogen, renewable natural gas, which are probably of more interest to this audience. So what kind of benefits come along with participating in the CFR? Essentially, the primary benefit here is to provide money that can help with a transition to a low carbon transportation fleet. So again, moving to things like electric buses, hydrogen buses, renewable natural gas buses that are powered by renewable natural gas. The goal of the program is to promote the use of those fuels by providing additional funding and ultimately enhancing the total cost of ownership of these low carbon vehicles. We wanted to give everybody a little bit of an understanding of the potential opportunity here. So this map really focuses on the opportunity for electric transit buses. Again, other kinds of vehicles are eligible as well. But just wanted to provide a little bit of a context for folks looking at electrification for their fleet. So the way the program is designed, electric vehicles generate credits based on the carbon intensity of the grid in the province where the vehicles operate. So that explains why you see a little bit of difference here in terms of the potential value, depending on the province that we're talking about. So for this analysis, we've assumed that a particular bus is operating about 60,000 kilometers a year with an efficiency of 1.5 kilowatt hours per kilometer. And we're assuming roughly $200 a credit for the resulting credits, which is in line with what we've seen in the market so far. And as you can see, in Ontario, a bus kind of meeting those assumptions would generate around $28,000 a year in value under the CFR. And then again, that value varies depending on province. With the provinces with a less clean grid getting lower values. So that's kind of the opportunity that exists by participating in the CFR. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what 3Degrees does to help folks such as yourselves actually access the value under the CFR, and that's really a three-step process. So first, we want to make sure that we have an understanding of everything that you're doing that might be eligible. So we'll do a survey with you, try to understand all of the equipment that you might have in your fleet. I think for most of you, the buses are going to be the primary thing that we're going to be looking at. But, if there are support vehicles that are being electrified, or if you have other equipment kind of supporting your operations, we would take a look at those as well and try to understand where and how those might be applicable to the program. For electricity, accessing the program is relatively straightforward. Like I said, there's a grid carbon intensity for each province, and you essentially just report a against that carbon intensity to generate credits. If we're talking about other fuels like hydrogen or renewable natural gas, there's a little bit more of a process that's involved with being able to access the incentive. We need to establish what the carbon intensity score of those fuels is in order to essentially make sure that you're generating the correct number of credits, and that is a part of the work that we offer as well. Once we've identified kind of what the eligible equipment is, the kind of fuel that's being used, to make sure we understand pathway requirements, then we really get into the reporting. The CFR for the kinds of applications that we're talking about here is an annual program. So basically that means we would collect data over the course of a year, and then make sure that we are QAing and QCing that data, make sure that that's accurate and something that we can report to the regulator. And obviously we would also oversee the actual reporting and make sure that we're managing against the regulatory deadlines. Lastly, once we've done the reporting and we have credits, we'll take those credits to market and sell them on your behalf. And it is worth noting here that the entities who are buying these credits, as you might imagine, are pretty big entities, and so like to conduct transactions in relatively large quantities of credits. So this aggregation point is relatively important, making sure that we're able to combine credits from all of the partners that we're working with and take them to market in large batches, so that we're able to meet the expectations of the folks who are actually buying the credits. To that point, kind of just a review of what this cycle looks like. Again, the program is an annual one, so we would collect data for the fueling activity that happens over the course of the year, then do the reporting each year. The reports are due by the end of April. And one aspect of the clean fuel regulations is that reporting is subject to verification. So we would also oversee the verification work as part of this effort. And then once the credits are generated, again, take those to market. So we would expect credit money to flow, by the end of Q2 of each year for the prior year's activity. So if you're interested in finding out more about the program, or potentially working with 3Degrees, or at least understanding what the opportunity is for you and your particular situation, please feel free to reach out to John. His contact information is listed here, and will be shared with everybody after the presentation. And we can collect some relatively basic information from you about where your fleet's located, what your plans are in terms of moving to low carbon vehicles, what your expectations are for mileage, things like that. And we can put together a quick analysis for you to help you understand the potential value of participating in this program. So that's really what we had for you today. We wanted to give kind of a high level overview of the program and the opportunity that it represents. But we were really interested in hearing your questions, right? Things that maybe you've heard about the program that you're unclear on, or particular aspects of your application that you'd like to understand better. So we wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time for any questions that you have. So at this point, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I think looks like there's one question in the chat, so feel free to put questions in the chat if you'd like to do that, or if you want to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask, feel free. I think Karen will help moderate for us and make sure that we're capturing all the questions correctly. So there's a question about, are there requirements related to using buses with a certain energy consumption efficiency so that inefficient vehicles wouldn't just create more credits? So it's a fair question. The way the program is structured, there is one default value for electric buses. If we're talking about, well, for each type of vehicle, there's essentially one default value that the regulator uses to calculate credits. So if your vehicle is more efficient than the assumed value, you will generate fewer credits. If it's less efficient, you will generate more credits. So it's maybe a little bit of not quite the right incentive, but I think it's the regulator's way of trying to kind of simplify the process. It looks like Tyler has his hand raised, so maybe if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Yeah, so Tyler Seed here from Power on Energy Solutions. We actually recently, over the last few weeks and months, have been conducting a sort of evaluation and investigation into CFR credit aggregators on behalf of our clients, the TTC in Oakville and some others. And we'd like to set up a conversation with you afterwards. We can take that offline, of course. But just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your pricing structure.
Yeah, so in general, the approach that we take in most of these markets is what we call an index price approach, where essentially we are paying out a percentage of the credit value that is realized. We tend to operate on a tiered structure. The majority of the work here is relatively fixed, right? So we the payments to our partners increase as scale increases. So that's the typical approach that we take. In some markets, we are willing to offer a fixed price structure where we actually take on the market risk, and for some period of time, we'll guarantee a credit price. I think we're probably too early right now in this market to be able to offer that. I actually don't know that we've seen credits from these types of applications trade. We've seen credits from other applications trade in the market, but until we get a little bit better visibility into how the market's unfolding, we probably wouldn't be able to offer that structure. So I would say in general, our default approach would be that index price approach.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have another question.
Does the fixed price approach involve contracts for differences? No, it's just a straight, the way that we typically structure it is on a dollars or cents per kilowatt hour of charging activity, right? So we would say, for the next 3 years, we will pay you, X cents per kilowatt hour of charging activity. And that's just the straight payment that we make. And then whatever credit value we realize on the back end is ours. But yeah, it's a pretty straightforward approach.
There's a new question in the chat.
Yeah, can you elaborate on the verification process, criteria, and methods? Is it just based on charging sessions data collected from the chargers? Primarily, yes. There is also a requirement for site visits, although I believe if you have a number of entities that are being reported, it's kind of a random sampling of site visits. This is an area that has been a source of a bit of consternation in the market to date. I think primarily not due to the requirements of the verification or the verification process itself, but actually the number of approved verifiers or qualified verifiers, and basically the bandwidth that they have to do the verification, in the time frame that's required by ECCC. My expectation is that bandwidth constraint will be alleviated in coming years. We've seen additional groups go through the verification process or the qualification process to become qualified verifiers. So we think that will get better, and we have relationships with a number of the qualified verifiers. So we don't expect that to be a significant problem going forward.
Dave, while we're waiting for another question, I did want to ask people to notice that, again, this 3 Degrees presentation is very timely. Our ZEB committee meeting on Monday, October the 16th, is on ZEB economics and the clean fuel regulation. So consider this a very good primer for that continued discussion on the 16th. I've put the registration link for that meeting in the chat. And Dave, I think we do have another question.
Yeah, is there a public list of verified aggregators? So I don't know that there's a public list of aggregators. There is a public list of verifiers. So if you are interested in seeing who could potentially provide verification services, I believe ECCC does publish that. There's not really a distinction under the CFR between someone who is registered as a primary credit generator versus someone who's registered as an aggregator, kind of the role that we play. That there is a difference in some other programs, in particular in the US programs, but I don't think that ECCC has made that distinction. So I don't think that there is a public list of aggregators. Tyler?
Yeah, just on the question of verification. Actually, first I would just say, I don't think that our list is exhaustive, but we have compiled a bit of a list. Happy to share that with anybody who wants to talk after the call. Do you include the verification as part of your costed service, or is there an added cost on top of that?
Yeah, so verification would be a third-party expense that would be billed separately.
Understood.
Yeah, so there's a question around the eligible fuels that can participate, and whether credits can be matched with green power for additional value. So I'll hit the second one first. In programs like those in California, Oregon, and Washington, there is an ability to generate additional credits from the use of renewable energy in the form of RECs, renewable energy certificates, on a book and claim basis. So essentially what you can do is you can match your charging activity with an equal number of RECs and claim a carbon intensity of 0, which increases the number of credits that are generated. The CFR does not allow for that same kind of matching. It is strictly based on the grid carbon intensity of the province where you're operating. Now, the good news is that the largest provinces in Canada have pretty low carbon intensity scores already. So there wouldn't be a huge benefit to rec matching, or said another way, there's not a huge loss in not being able to match with recs. Unfortunately for any folks who might be located in a place like Nunavut, you are getting dinged for having a very high carbon intensity grid. And there's not an opportunity to offset that with renewable energy. So yeah, not the best outcome for every province, but again, the ones that are the largest tend to be in pretty good shape already. In terms of the eligible fuels that can participate in the CFR, it's really any fuel that is displacing gasoline or diesel used in a transportation application. There's a process that, depending on the fuel type, you might be able to get in with kind of a known kind of off-the-shelf score, or there might be a relatively straightforward process to getting a score. In other cases, you might have to go through a relatively drawn-out process to determine what that score is. But again, for this audience, things like electricity, hydrogen, renewable natural gas are all going to be things that can qualify. Let's see. Good question. So, trying to draw a distinction between the various colors of hydrogen. So, green hydrogen being electrolytic hydrogen produced using renewable electricity, gray hydrogen being fossil derived hydrogen, blue hydrogen being, I'm assuming, gray hydrogen that has carbon capture put on the back. So in other words, natural gas fed hydrogen production process, but capturing the CO2 that's produced from that. So there is a process to develop kind of a standard, or not standard, a project specific carbon intensity score for various fuels that are produced, including blue hydrogen. Unfortunately, each of these programs seems to like to take their own approach to doing life cycle assessments. So Canada has adopted a model called the Open LCA model that is used to determine the life cycle carbon intensity of these fuels. But it does have the ability to model each one on a life cycle basis. And so, yes, there is a process, regardless of the kind of hydrogen, the feedstock, the end use, all of those kinds of things. There is a process for developing a carbon intensity score. And that is work that our company does as well, is developing those carbon intensity scores and the pathways and making sure that those fuel sources are eligible for reporting. So there's a question here about whether electrolytic hydrogen uses the provincial grid emissions intensity. It's a good question. I think I would have to look into that and get back to you. I don't know the specifics. If I remember correctly, on-site renewables paired with electrolytic hydrogen, you can claim basically zero carbon intensity for the electricity that is used. But if I remember correctly, I don't believe that RECs can be used in that application either. But that's something that I think I would have to do a little more looking into to give you a firm answer.
Sorry, I'm struggling to figure out how to raise my hand here. I'm running it on my browser. My name is Balsar. I hail from WSP Canada. One more question. best to speak it out. There's a bit of lobbying around, allowing credit generation based on the capacity of your fueling stations. I'm just not sure how that transpired in the last 2 years. And I noticed you specified that credits will be generated based on the amount of fuel dispensed. And so is that, supposed to stay for a while, or is there hope that ECCC will allow credit generation based on the capacity of your fueling stations?
Yeah, good question. So just to level set for other folks, Canada or California and Washington, as part of their programs, do allow for generating credits. It's essentially a capacity crediting mechanism for deploying zero emissions fueling infrastructure. So DC fast chargers and hydrogen refueling stations are able to generate crediting kind of independent of the amount of fuel that's actually dispensed from them, just by making the capacity available. That is not something that is included in the CFR. Unclear about whether or not that will come about later. We do have a regulatory team that tracks those developments, but I have not heard anything kind of indicating that the regulations will be updated to include that. But that's something that I can ask them about specifically to understand, what they've heard on that point. Thanks for the question.
Okay, I may as well just.
You got it.
Yeah.
You found the raise hand button.
Quite a while. Yeah, thanks for your patience, Dave.
No, you're good.
So based on your study of the British Columbia and California markets, I was wondering what your observations were on, basically the volatility in credit prices and how they affected decisions to uptake certain ambitious fuels, like let's say green hydrogen. The key here is, at least personally, for the last couple of years, I've seen the CFR mechanism as a potentially important gap filler in the price premium between ambitious fuels like green hydrogen and diesel. The unfortunate thing is that credit prices will be volatile, revenues are unreliable, and so there's not enough investor confidence. In your study of the California and British Columbia markets, what was the kind of lag that you observed from the initiation of this policy instrument to the uptake of ambitious fuels like green hydrogen? Did it take 6, 7, 8 years for investors to really have the confidence to rely on LCFS revenues in their business cases to then go and install green hydrogen refueling stations and infra? Or was it much faster? It's just that, yeah, in the initial years of the deployment of this instrument, we're just expecting renewable fuels to benefit to an extent, or at least fuel suppliers to take that direction, right? But we actually need this kind of instrument to function strongly for more ambitious fuels, right? And it's kind of unsure how long it'll take for this to be a go-to instrument.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the British Columbia LCFS is a tough one to really use as a benchmark, just because that market is super small, very illiquid. Prices are very high there, although we would expect prices to come down as CFR, as the CFR kind of comes into force. And that market gets kind of up and running. So, but we can talk about California. That program came into force in 2011, but I would say it it wasn't really something that people looked to until about 2016, because that's when all of the lawsuits were resolved. So for folks who aren't familiar, as is the case in the US with any environmental program, basically the day the program took effect, the regulator got hit with a bunch of lawsuits. It took a few years for those lawsuits to get resolved, but since about 2016, the program's been running pretty well, and I think at almost every conference I attend where there's a representative from the California Air Resources Board, which is the regulator for that program, they make a point of saying nobody's suing us, which is in marked contrast to the federal EPA under the Renewable Fuel Standard program. So that said, yeah, so let's take 2016 as kind of the first year that the program was really working. Credit prices got as high as about $210 in 2021. And today they're like mid 60s, 65s to $70. The entire reason for that is basically renewable diesel. So I would say starting at about 2019, so about 3 years in, prices looked to be coming up consistently. And I think that's when people started to make investment decisions around bringing online a lot of new renewable diesel capacity because of these elevated prices. And now that renewable diesel is just flooding the market and causing prices to crash. So I think I don't remember whether it was last quarter or last year, I think it was last quarter, over 50% of the diesel consumed in California was renewable diesel. So, it's had a huge displacement effect in that market. So, from a regulator's perspective, I think they would argue that the program is operating exactly as intended. High prices drove a signal to deploy more fuels. Those fuels got deployed, and now that's driving prices down. Of course, from a project developer perspective, that's not great, because it, like you said, it drives that volatility. So, in California, they're taking action to try and reduce some of that volatility in upcoming program changes. We'll see whether or not that kind of volatility exists here, and what action, if any, ECCC takes in response. But to answer kind of your first question, I would say it took about 3 years for people to start relying on those hot credit prices as an indicator of something that could support a project. But now I think basically no bank is willing to build that in to a model, or if they do, it's at a very low level, exactly because of the volatility that you've identified. So yeah, it kind of ebbs and flows from both sides. Doug.
Hi. So in words, yeah, it's a little easier not to. I can elaborate a little on my earlier question. So I can see how gray hydrogen is pretty straightforward. It's just fossil fuel. It's not good. Blue hydrogen, like you said, it's really complicated in terms of each project, and the actual, I guess, efficiency and long-term stability of the carbon capture would be the key thing. It's changing very rapidly, right? Green hydrogen seems like it's also complicated, which I guess is part of what you're getting at, because if you're just producing it directly yourself, it's probably pretty much similar to charging. It's like it's the electricity and how carbon intensive that is. But there's cases where somebody might bring their hydrogen in from a place with a really low production intensity, but then you've got the intensity of the transportation itself. So yeah, I guess I'm curious on the thinking and all that. And then the other one I was curious too about is renewable natural gas, because it relies so much on the idea of avoided emissions from what they're using, and how would that be assessed? So I guess these things, is it driven by like regulations, and how flexible are those regulations to, I guess, encompass everything that's going on?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing that I like to point out in these kinds of conversations, which I have an engineering background, so this next statement that I'm going to make drives the engineer in me crazy, but the reality is that a carbon intensity score is as much a regulatory decision as it is an engineering fact. And what I mean by that is things like, do you allow rec matching? And if so, what are the rules around rec matching? Do you allow renewable natural gas produced from a dairy digester to get credit for avoided methane emissions from what it would otherwise do or not? How do you define what that other baseline is, right? So those are the kinds of regulatory decisions that ultimately drive the carbon intensity score. Generally speaking, these programs look at life cycle assessment on what they call a well to wheels basis. So it's from everything from where did the feedstock come from and what's the carbon intensity associated with that feedstock through the actual use in the vehicle, and adding up the emissions kind of at every step along the way. So to your point, Doug, about if you have, hydrogen that's produced in Ontario, with a low grade carbon intensity score, and then maybe trucked somewhere else, it would get credit for that low carbon intensity score from the grid, and then it would get penalized for the emissions associated with transportation. Unless, and I know some folks are looking at this, the vehicle using to distribute the hydrogen is itself a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, right? In which case that would get kind of integrated into the analysis. So yes, it does get quite complicated, and ends up becoming very project specific. From an RNG perspective, yes, in Canada, they do allow avoided methane emissions crediting. There's actually a provision in the regulation that we're evaluating. In the US programs, we do a lot of work with dairy digesters who are then producing electricity, and using the RECs that are produced from those facilities to generate additional credits under the programs in the US. There's a similar kind of provision under the CFR that allows for dairy digester facilities that are producing electricity to generate credits, and so we're also working with a number of projects in Canada on that as well. From an RNG used as a fuel perspective, it would be the same thing, right? You'd get the avoided methane crediting on the front end, and then it's a question of, okay, how does it get from the project to the point where it's actually used, and kind of accounting for all of those emissions along the way.
Okay, just thank you. One quick follow-up then. This whole process of figuring out for any particular fuel source, what it's eligible for. Do you guys do that, or is that somebody else? I think I might have missed that. And if people get rated and then they feel like they've changed things, like how long do they have to wait before they can come back for like a reassessment?
Yes. So on the first question, yes, that is work that we do. Under the Canadian program, folks who do that work are I think the official term is CI score contributors. So that is work that we do. We've done quite a lot of that in the US, and are deep into getting a better understanding of the Open LCA, so that we are ready to do that work in Canada as well. Regarding timing and timelines and things, I think this is something we're still waiting to understand a little bit better from ECCC. You know, each regulator kind of takes their own view on how that works. I will say there's an ability to get what's essentially a temporary CI score for those fuels that you can use for 12 months. It's not a good score, but it's, you know, it's a conservative score that that the regulator makes available so that you can get some credit generation while you're going through kind of the approval process. And then from there are kind of varying levels of the approach that can be taken. The next level up is, I liken it kind of to like a Lego approach, where it's like, you know, you've got a feedstock category, and within the feedstock category, you've got like 3 bricks that you can choose from. So you pick your brick from the feedstock category. And then you've got the production category, and within the production category, you've got like 5 bricks that you can choose from, and you take your production brick and you stack it on top of your feedstock brick, and you keep doing that kind of through the whole process until you get to a final score. Again, not the most flexible approach, right? Because there's only certain categories that you can choose from, and so it's probably not going to be a perfect fit. But it's probably going to give you a better result than kind of that temporary approach. And then the third approach is just the full-blown LCA approach, right? So diving into the model, evaluating your specific project, and getting a really tailored carbon intensity score. But as you can imagine, that's a much bigger undertaking, right? Both in the amount of data that's required, the time to put the model together, the time to get the regulator to review it, you know, all of those things are just longer. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Last call for questions. We have plenty of time. I know I've learned a lot. I still don't speak the regulation, but Dave, this has been very helpful. Following the webinar, we will make the slides available and the recording available, but we don't want to cut anyone off. We've got lots of time. Soumya.
Thanks, Karen. So one more about provincial boundaries. Will the credit generation or will calculations be based on the province that you sell your fuel in, or the province that you generate your fuel in?
It would be based on where the fuel is generated.
Okay.
And just to add on to that, that was reminded me, Sonia, there was a meeting I was in recently where somebody was talking about the potential to bring in hydrogen from a nearby state. And can that work? And if so, how does that work?
Yes. So like if you were, just to make sure I'm clear, like let's say
if you're in Winnipeg and you want to bring it in from North Dakota.
Got it. Yeah. Yes, you can. So there is a provision for generating credits for fuels that are imported. Same general concepts apply, right? It's still a well-to-wheels basis. So we would be looking at, you know, what's the grid carbon intensity in North Dakota? Probably not great. You know, and then what are the emissions associated with you know, transporting it up to Winnipeg? Now, of course, the benefit that you would have there is that project would be eligible for the USPTC, which would drive down production costs, right? So it could still be cost advantaged. So yeah, there are a number of other factors that go in there, but yes, the general concept of importing fuel from another country and using it in Canada, you can generate credit for that.
Yeah, Manitoba is probably not one of the places that would be most motivated to do that. They're doing fine, I guess, on their grid intensity. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I guess last call. Dave, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And Karen, thank you for the venue and the opportunity. I look forward to the ZEV committee meeting on Monday at 3 o'clock Eastern. And I look forward to seeing you at the QTRIC conference on Tuesday. We're coming up on top of the hour. Is there one or two last questions? Anyone from a transit agency has a quick question or?
John, I'll just mention you've put your email in the chat there, and we'll certainly make it available to others, particularly our transit system members. It's the beauty of an association. We come together with business members and transit system members. They are experts, and through the association, it makes it easier to learn about these very timely topics in a way that doesn't compromise any future procurements or anything that you may want to do. So we're very pleased to have worked with you today on that. Thank you, John, and thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for making this venue available for us, and we look forward to having further discussions with you all.
Thank you again. We'll stay in touch. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
So much. Bye-bye.